These are not the satanic ritual abuses you're looking for.
Lately, strange new things sometimes appeared in the sky. Noisy birds that flew without flapping their wings. One day, something fell from the sky. It looked like water, but it was harder than anything else in the world.
And if any of what he writes is true, it's a cult that has long ties to Gotham.
Something is always happening, but when it happens, people don't always see it, or understand it, or accept it.
Time is on my side. Yes, it is.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. There's a story that has stuck with me since I heard it the first time. During World War II, one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena ever documented unfolded across the South Pacific. Islanders, indigenous peoples who had never seen industrial technology, suddenly found their neighboring islands transformed into military staging grounds. Both the Allied and the Japanese both used these islands for their forces. They built bases or landed aircraft. But one of the most interesting things was they would drop by airplane these big cargo boxes that would be filled with food, medicine, various supplies. And every once in a while, the winds were wrong or whatever, they would float down and land on one of these indigenous people's islands. And so, of course, they'd find, new food, new medicine, new supplies of all kinds. And it was as if the gods were giving them these gifts. And then when the war had ended and all of the soldiers departed, the cargo stopped falling from the sky. And that era of surplus began to cause a decline in their culture. And so they started building effigies of these airplanes, hoping that the gods would send another batch of cargo their way. The anthropologists began calling these movements cargo cults. The most famous example is the John Frum movement on the island of Tanna in Vanuatu. And to this day, villagers still raise American flags, hold military-style parades, and await the return of John Frum, a figure associated with the arrival of goods and prosperity. And as far as we can tell, those rituals are sincere. They're not a parody. They seem to be attempts to recreate the conditions that once brought abundance from the sky. The lesson of the cargo cult appears to be clear. When humans encounter advanced technology without understanding how it works, we often interpret it through ritual and myth. We assign meaning, we form beliefs, and we construct practices designed to bring the phenomenon back. And this is not confined to the South Pacific. The same structure shows up again and again in modern religious and cultural movements. Today, it is often tied to UFOs. Take Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard began as a science fiction writer, and the theology he built is deeply tied to extraterrestrial narratives. At its core is the story of Xenu, an intergalactic ruler who transported billions of beings to Earth some 75 million years ago, stuck them around a bunch of volcanoes, and then destroyed them with basically hydrogen bombs. And then the souls of those beings, as Scientology teaches, still cling to us today as Thetans. The church promises that through costly, elaborate rituals, auditing sessions, courses, initiations, one can free themselves from these alien burdens and ascend to a higher level of being. But if you strip away the glossy facade, and it looks very much like a cargo cult, rituals designed to gain access to cosmic technology and power beyond human reasoning? Yeah. Now, let's consider Mormonism. In the early 19th century, Joseph Smith claimed to have received golden plates from an angel named Moroni. These plates, delivered from above and translated with divine instruments, became the foundation of an entirely new religious movement. Mormonism is not usually technically categorized as a UFO cult. The pattern appears to be recognizable. Heavenly messengers bringing sacred technology, communities build on the promise of contact with powers from beyond, and in some of these Mormon offshoots, extraterrestrials have been explicitly folded into the theology, blurring the line between angel and alien. Then there's the Heaven's Gate, the clearest example of a UFO cargo cult in the modern era. Founded by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles in the 70s, the group believed that Earth was due for a kind of recycling, and that salvation could only come by leaving the planet. In 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet approached, members became convinced that a spacecraft was traveling behind it, waiting to take them to a higher place of existence. They prepared meticulously, dressing in identical clothing and sneakers, performing a ritual exit through coordinated suicide, believing it would allow them to join that craft. Their entire system was built around the expectation that extraterrestrial technology would deliver them. What unites all of these examples is the cargo cult pattern. In each case, mysterious power appears, whether it's military cargo, golden plates, cosmic rulers, spacecraft. The followers respond by building rituals and communities to re-establish contact with that power. They imitate what they believe will bring it back, and they wait for the return of it. Now, while it's tempting to dismiss these movements as fringe or absurd, cargo cults remind us that this is not an anomaly. It seems to be a deeply human response. When faced with the unknown, especially with technology or phenomena that outstrip our understanding, we build myths, we ritualize, we form religions. And so today, when people gather around UFO videos, leaked government documents, or whispered promises of disclosure, the question presses in: are we any different than the indigenous peoples of the South Pacific? Are modern UFO movements, whether in the form of churches, cults, or online communities, just another expression of the same impulse? That impulse to summon cargo from the sky? Because whether it's the people of Tana waiting for John Frum, the faithful of Scientology climbing the ladder of operating thetans, the Mormons treasuring their golden plates, or Heaven's Gate believers preparing for the comet, the pattern remains the same. Humanity sees something it cannot explain, and it builds a religion to call it back. So the question is not whether these movements are absurd. The question is whether they reveal something fundamental about us, something we'd rather not admit. That maybe the line between an islander with a coconut radio and a modern believer live streaming UFO hearing is thinner than we think. So I have to ask, when it comes to UFOs, are we investigating a mystery? Or are we already worshiping at the altar of a new cargo cult? What if I told you that some of the world's oldest religions aren't inspired by gods at all, but by visitors from the stars, being so advanced that our ancestors bowed before them, built monuments in their honor, and prayed for their return? Did the Sumerians worship astronauts? Did the Egyptians build landing pads? Yeah, and here's the real kicker. Did those same patterns survive into modern religions hiding in plain sight? From Mormon cosmology to the Zenu myth of Scientology, Are these the new temples of an ancient idea? Are we living in the golden age of UFO cults? Today we're going to dive headfirst into that question. With a man who doesn't pull back the curtain, he tears it off the wall. He's the maestro of the mind bend, the captain of the culture of the section, the grand master of GCD himself, JJ Vance. Welcome back to Truth in the Shadow podcast.
BT, greetings, sir. Great to be back. I appreciate the invite, and you're talking my language, sir. Ancient alien cargo cults, that's what I like to get into. So, JJ Vance, host of Operation GCD, and not the vice president. Don't get me confused, but great to join you again for the conversation, and hopefully we get into some of this weird Oregon stuff, because Oregon is one of the two states in the union I have not visited. The other one being Alaska, and I'll never visit that place for other horse of a different color. But Oregon, I've tried to visit numerous times, but the universe has impeded.
That sounds like something. So, JJ, when we talk like cargo cults, and specifically ancient alien cargo cults, most people are going to think about the tribes back in World War II who would build like these airplanes and things like that. But I think the ancient alien style is a little bit bigger of an idea. Can you dive into that, explain to someone who's never heard that term?
Yes, sir. It's the same. You're on target. It's the same concept, right? So the concept of these South Pacific cults are, tribes in the Amazon that have been contacted in similar capacities since World War II. But World War II saw an onslaught of aircraft flying all over the South Pacific, dropping cargo on various small island chains. And sometimes that cargo missed its target and landed on one they didn't intend to, with a native tribe that suddenly got a big box marked G.I. Joe. And they would then create a whole religion where that was God that dropped they created a God that was their God on this island. This drop, G.I. Joe was their God, and they're doing dances and they create rituals and they build model aircrafts that depict the same thing that they saw fly overhead. And while that was their reality, it wasn't actually reality. And that's kind of you apply those same concepts. Some of these tribes apparently still do this today. Right. So this is, nearly 100 years after the fact. And we're seeing the application of what occurs when such these kind of cargo cults erupt over such strange circumstances. And I would argue that's the same thing we're dealing with the ancient alien cargo cults. But instead of G.I. Joe dropping off supplies, we have, probably millennia ago, to be quite honest with you. These ideas formed in some capacity were folks from the sky, because they're, worshiping the stars or worshiping the moon, the sun. And they create these myths that there's some sort of, alien folks from those places we see in the sky that have seeded Earth. And then as a result of that, and I'm assuming some event occurred that caused that in a similar capacity to the South Pacific Islands. What that event was, it's inconclusive, but we can see the result of some sort of event that has caused that and transpired into circumstances we see today with the modern day incarnations of the Mormons or the Scientologists or the Jehovah's Witnesses or so on and so forth. I could go on for about 10 minutes naming these cults, and they all have an ancient alien cargo cult variety because they all have a belief system in an ancient alien civilization that's seeded the planet, and they're trying to. They're much like those Pacific Islanders. They're stuck in a system where they're replicating these rituals they developed to try to get G.I. Joe to drop more supplies. They're building, model aircraft, some variation of that idea, like the South Pacificers are doing, and that's what drives, in my opinion, that's what drives a lot of our modern Western politics. Is a lot of these kind of cargo cult principles. We're doing things that'll never going to be achievable. And we see these things, I think, exhibited by the fact that we have a History Channel. It's not about history. It's got like 17,000 seasons of Ancient Aliens on it, right?
Yeah, this is something that kind of blows my mind as you start digging into this idea. A lot of them exist in the modern times, and you personally have some experience with the Mormon Church. So let's talk a little bit about that, some of their cosmology, specifically like what's the planet, Kolob or something like that? I mean, it all sounds kind of sci-fi.
Yes, sir. Oh, it's super sci-fi. And the ceremonial magic aspects of it are the same that Aleister Crowley uses, the same ceremonial stuff you'll find in the OTO then, which Scientology is an offshoot of. So there's a lot of ceremonial magic stuff that is rooted in the same materials of the the grimoires, if you will, that rooted in the same grimoires. And these folks recognize it, as well. These practitioners of these things will salute one another. You have folks that are today in our modern era that are associated with the neo-process movement, an offshoot of Scientology. The process, I would call it the dark wing of Scientology, but individuals associated with that, occultists, ceremonial magicians, Thelemites, professed followers of Crowley who adore Joseph Smith. Folks like Damien Eccles, he loves Joseph Smith, and because he recognizes the same thing that he adores about Crowley and his magic that he sees in Joseph Smith. So there's a lot of crossover between these things, but the alien cosmology is seemingly all rooted in the star system Sirius, right?
Okay.
So the Mormons, everyone loves Sirius. They're real serious about Sirius, and the Mormons are not discluded from that because Kolob, you're spot on. Kolob is a planet next to Sirius, and that's where God lives. So Jesus Christ in the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, Jesus Christ is like a second or third hand character, if you will. Joseph Smith's obviously number one. He started the joint, but then you got this alien Kolob guy, right? God, and Jesus is his son, right? So he's kind of number 2 to number 3 there, right? With Jesus number 3, right? So that's the story, though, in Mormon religion is Jesus was an immaculate conception via this alien dude on Kolob, but they don't hit you that like Scientology. They won't hit you that coming in the door. Like I was a Mormon for 22 years. I went to seminary school, which you got to do if you want to go on a mission. You got to go to like the Mormon high school. So before high school every year, or for my first 2 years of high school, I went before school for like an hour and a half to Mormon church for school. And then I did homeschool. I graduated early, so I did 2 years my junior year of homeschool. I still graduated early in seminary too, not just high school. So I made sure I did my Mormon stuff at the time. And then I joined the military, but I continued to be a Mormon for a number of years in my military service into the adulthood priesthood. So I got all the priesthoods. And even then, they don't really get into the alien stuff. And looking into Scientology, I can see a lot of comparisons from my experiences to how they treat their alien stuff. So you can't talk about Xenu in like public forums if you don't have the proper clearance or level, right, in Scientology.
Right.
So
Right.
it's kind of the same way in Mormonism. I didn't ever really get to that high, but I did get the priesthood levels to start, I was always asking questions about the magic and the aliens, right? And they were never answering them. So it was a lot of disputes early on because they're not really formal about it in this day and age.
An interesting idea that within the LDS, it's every soul was soul babies of God on Kolob, and then you
pick your parents on Kolob, then they ship you down here.
Right. I mean, you're incarnated. It sounds a whole lot like Highlander. You're from a whole different planet, and you incarnate on this planet. And
well, I mean, there's some Scottish roots to these folks that started Mormonism.
Right. Right. And then we get something like when we talk about Scientology, and you've got L. Ron Hubbard, science fiction author, but he gave us this modern myth where Earth is basically a prison planet.
Yeah, and it's not that different from what Joseph Smith's professing. There's some heavy Gnosticism within Mormonism and their theology, and the way that they beam the babies down from in the Xenu myths is the same way that the Mormons describe it. So the Mormons, you pick your parents and they ship you down. It's a little bit more prison planet-like with the Scientology version, but it's the same thing where you get to see, like, so when you're on Kolob as a baby, or a spirit, I'm sorry, you get to watch like a movie of like your parents. You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be those parents. And then in Scientology, you get to watch a movie, but it's like the prison planet version of it, right?
The South Pacific and indigenous peoples and finding these things. It's what was bouncing around in Joseph Smith's or Hubbard's mind to be coming up with this. What are they tapping into?
Demons. I don't know. I think my opinion, all aliens are demons. And I make that point to make this point with stuff with Crowley, the OTO, the Agape Lodge, all these things. We see all these connections between Satanism. Not only is the idea of all this Crowley stuff being Satanism, all of the leaders of what would later be declared Satanism LaVey, Aquino, the Wiccan leaders, Buckland, Gardner, they all made statements to the effect that Crowley was more Satanism than anyone and than LaVey ever could be. So these are all the same topics. We see membership across all of these aspects. Original member, there's one dude who goes from, he's one of the original members of the Agape Lodge here in America, the OTO stuff, under Parsons. And then he's as a result of that, and his buddy L. Ron, him and L. Ron, L. Ron joins the Science Fiction Writers Club in Los Angeles to Forrest J. Ackerman. At the same time all of this is going on, him, Parsons, and Ackerman and Hubbard all hanging out. And then they all join Scientology. So he's an early Scientologist. And then in 1966, he joins the Church of Satan, Forrest J. Ackerman. And he's the editor in sci-fi to all these sci-fi writers. And he ran a sci-fi writers club with all the names, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Bradbury, you name them, right? And he's a connecting principle. So there's a lot of these things that indicate these are all the same ideas and philosophies, just rewrapped and sold to the general public in a different light and perspective. But that being said, we see folks like Ghislaine Maxwell. She's in the news a lot. So she's the number one poster on Reddit, by the way. I'm not sure if you knew that. And yesterday when she was in that meeting with the DOJ, that number one poster on Reddit just happened to post for the first time in 5 years. Maxwell Hill, just saying. So
interesting.
We look at her brother-in-law, her sister's husband, a fellow by the name of, I believe, Roger Molina. He's the son of Frank Molina. Frank Molina was Jack Parsons' number 2 on his Suicide Squad, right? And that whole scene down there where he creates the solid-state rocket fuel for NASA through ceremonial ritual magic, right? So that's the Parsons. And you look at Parsons' son, Maxwell's brother-in-law. He says he's a computer science engineer and one of the early inventors of search engines on the interwebs, by the way. He will use the term alien and demon interchangeably in discussions with those folks in which he communicates. I would argue Timothy Wiley of the Process Church, founding member, also does the same when he's describing the Watchers, these disembodied spirits that exist outside of the earthen plane.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at someone like Michael Heiser, who writes about the divine council worldview, which would be the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, a demonic kind of force. I usually use the word sinister forces, kind of borrowed that from Peter Levenda. It's, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the fallen angels who are their parents, and then humans who cooperate with them.
Right. Well, that's a good way to look at it right there, I think. That's a pretty accurate description from my perspective. Now, isn't it interesting, though, that the folks we get all these tales from are occultists, no different than Levenda. I respect a lot of his work, but I take it, also I understand that he Shyamalan twisted me in that Sinister Forces series, blamed it all on the Republicans. I'm onto you, Levenda. I see that. I saw that one coming.
We saw that one
so there's a little bit of his politics that come into there, but he also is an occultist of a Typhonian OTO variety. So confirmed, he's doing OTO rituals on the Discovery Channel back in 2009.
When we're looking at this like alien narrative, are we looking at something that's designed for control? Who's benefiting? I mean, is this kind of another idea of the Gnostic idea of the demiurge?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think who's benefiting is they use it as a system of control, but there are true believers, right? There are true believers. And in that aspect, we've seen in recent years, speaking of the Mormons, a former Mormon who was actually went on a mission as well. So he went to seminary. Stephen Greenstreet with the New York Post. He's done a great series on outing all this Mormon connectivity to these alien agendas that tie right into Michael Aquino's buddies and John Alexander and non-lethal weapons and Army PSYOPs. And so there are a religious aspect to it, and there are a PSYOP aspect to it with the Skinwalker Ranch folks and whatnot that Greenstreet highlighted. Well, he's also pointed out more recently that all this stuff out of a small religious cult in the Pentagon, and Stephen Greenstreet's work has highlighted all of that. So you see what I'm saying? We see both the true believers and the PSYOP stuff kind of crossing over.
No, I have no doubt that these are the same kind of people that have absolutely 100% faith in what they do. I mean, they believe just as much as any Christian or anything.
Precisely. And in that respect, if you apply the concept that they're built like if you understand the framework in which they're operating under, for example, we'll just use these Pentagon cultists, the ancient alien cargo cultists, that the New York Post ran that headline saying, alien cultists are running the defense in the Pentagon, right? So that was the headline. So, and they're spot on because that's what's going on here. And it's folks that wealthy families like we see every time. From the 1951 seance that Peter Levender writes about in the Alien Seance, that I would argue also is PSYOPs because it involves a military intelligence PSYOPs officer, Andrea Puharich. Nonetheless, it involves all of these blue blood families. Well, that's who we see in the Pentagon. The Mellon family, for example, is at the heart of that. The Rockefeller family finances Stephen Greer, finances all of the Project Camelot stuff, finances the early onset of the Skinwalker Ranch. That's all out of Lawrence Rockefeller's pocketbook. So we see the same kind of patterns there. So but the framework these folks are operating under, the cultists in the Pentagon or their financiers, is the same framework those folks in that South Pacific Island are working with when they're building a model wooden airplane to try to get G.I. Joe to drop them more supplies. They're G.I. Joe God, right? So what I'm saying is these folks are doing activities that are never going to have any results to them of any reasonable capacity. And they're doing so in a manner which is an ancient alien cargo cult manner, right? They're doing things to pretend like they're trying to achieve this goal of getting their God, their ancient alien cargo cult God, to do something for them or return something, right? To achieve something with their Godhead. But like the South Pacific Islanders are when they're doing the weird dancing rituals in the model airplanes, no matter how many times they do that, G.I. Joe ain't coming back.
Right.
Same goes for the Rockefellers, the and gang, the Pentagon cult, the Mellons, whatever they're doing, they're building model wooden airplanes and dancing silly, and they're tormenting the rest of society in the process, and they're running psychological operations because they want to convince us of their worldview. That's why we have 17,000 seasons of ancient aliens on the History Channel, starring John Podesta.
Right.
Who introduced the term UAP to the world.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like every single time humanity gets this giant tech leap, the atomic age, the space race, now it's, AI, it really seems like we see this rise in these UFO cults. And I don't think this is just a coincidence.
Not only is it not a coincidence, when we're talking about control and psychological operations, I think they've created a system where we can't advance technology past the 1930s. And and part of the magic show with these cults is to distract from that effort. So if you think about it, all of our modern conveyances and technologies we deal with here, conveniences and technologies, is, I'm currently enjoying air conditioning because someone's activated the alien weather devices at nearby Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So we have air conditioning. We have a lot of our modern engineering of our automobiles, aircraft, washers and dryers, et cetera. These kind of things are all thanks to inventions of Nazi Germany. And I think in large part, we're still in the 1930s and 20s, or disregard 30s, late 20s, early 30s, into the late 30s, that these were the inventions of that era of these German scientists. Oh, sounds like we're getting... I think someone ordered the apocalypse. We've had tornadoes, dude. It's like 100 degrees. Skies are opening up again right now. I don't have a tornado warning, but nonetheless, you see what I'm saying? Like, I think we have the same machinations at play of control to convince us that when have you seen the last advancement in an automobile outside of, making the body lighter and more aerodynamic in which to achieve greater gas mileage? There's nothing else that's been advanced since the 1930s with seatbelt and the windshield wiper, maybe, right?
Well, no, because that's absolutely 100% true.
Yeah, I'm talking about the internal combustion aspects of the matter, right? The engines and the operations.
Well, we had battery-operated cars, though, too, in the 30s.
Right.
The Tesla vehicles and all the other electric vehicles, that's not really new. That's just re-envisioned. That's using, instead of nickel cell batteries, it's now using ion lithium. That's correct, sir. So in this, what you're describing, I think, is in this system, and we're in this, what do they call it? Controlled obsolescence. So, we had light bulbs that ran 100. We have light bulbs from the turn of the last century, the previous century, that still run, I believe, still today. If not, they've stopped in recent years. So nonetheless, we've been put into a control system of these psychological operations the ancient alien cargo cultists are trying to convince us of their worldviews.
in varying capacities through media onslaught of propaganda, through the actual perpetration of these cults. All of these cults, these ancient alien cargo cults, get very spooky very fast. And it's not just, Office of Navy Intelligence Officer L. Ron Hubbard and his Scientology and his band of Navy weirdos, alien weirdos, they float around the earth, right? They all dress in the naval uniforms. They all think they're some sort of paramilitary outfit. It's weird. But we see the spooky aspects to it, right? And I think that's part of the whole control system and the convincing us of their worldviews is that's one application of their methods. 17,000 episodes of Ancient Aliens on the quote-unquote History Channel, I think, would be another application of those methods. But we see the controlled obsolescence in technology, though, right? So not only have we not achieved it, we used to have better beforehand, right? I think that's what you're saying, right?
That is exactly what I'm saying, is that this idea that these groups of individuals are using these UFO religions as a social engineering tool. When I put it that way, it makes it sound like a conspiracy. But honestly, dude, so was MK Ultra before the FOIA reports came out.
Yeah, here's the thing. They all do drugs, guns, and hookers, right? So they're all selling people sex, drugs, and guns. And that's how all these cults are they're all getting caught financing. It's not just the process. Here's the dark wing of Scientology. The Mormons have their history of these matters as well. But one more recent history that's connected directly to Waco and the Heaven's Gate cult. You wouldn't think Waco, they might be an ancient alien cargo cult. Seems like they are. And they all fall within the same framework of spooky operations. So there was a cult called the Order of the Solar Temple, who was run by a French mercenary from the Congo. That's a different story altogether. But they were videotaped. The cult leaders were videotaped saying after the Waco event that the Waco folks beat them to the punch. Now, they would later do their own Heaven's Gate style mass suicide event. And then an offshoot of that cult from 95, when they did theirs, would do a mass ritual suicide event trying to catch Halley's Comet, Hale-Bopp Comet there in 1998 at the same time as the Heaven's Gate cult. So you have the Order of the Solar Temple in Montreal. You have the Heaven's Gate cult down in San Diego. They're doing the same things at the same time, trying to catch the same comet. And the leaders of that Order of the Solar Temple were dealing drugs, guns, and hookers, and they claimed the Branch Davidians beat them to the punch.
Yeah, and if we talk about a little bit about Hubbard and his kind of legacy and his idea, you had been digging into and researching this potential offshoot of Scientology here in my home state of Oregon. What are they doing? I mean, is this dude like a Hubbard 2.0 or something darker?
I think Oregon is a long-time epicenter and hotbed of cult activity. So speaking of Heaven's Gate, most of their cult was comprised of descendants from a cult in Oregon, in Corvallis, Oregon, from the 1920s called the Holy Rollers. They were a Christian kind of fundamentalist evangelical style movement, but it was a sex cult. The leader was banging everybody, Eben Creffield. And he runs off with one of the daughters, I believe, one of the cult members, and the cult gets banished to Waldport, Oregon, on the coastline. Most of the town of Waldport, there was like 100 people live there, and then there was like 250 cult members who moved in there, right? So then, I don't know, maybe those numbers aren't exactly right, but it was a large volume of that town suddenly became the Holy Rollers. They got banished out of Corvallis. And 50 years later, Marshall Applewhite leaves a mental health institution in Texas along with his nurse. They travel directly to Waldport, Oregon, host a seminar to recruit for their new ancient alien cargo cult, Heaven's Gate, which still operates today. And recently, a member of that cult posted on social media for the first time in, I believe, 5 years. So there's a lot of weird stuff around. All these things never die; they never go away. But they recruit all those holy rollers. That is the composition of most of their early cult. The core membership of their cult was out of that one seminar in Waldport in 1972 or something like that. And it was all the descendants from the Holy Rollers. So how did they know to go there? What were the Holy Rollers doing? My question there then is, what were the Holy Rollers doing? They're known as a Christian kind of fundamentalist sex cult thing. Well, they clearly seem to be doing some sort of ancient alien cargo cult stuff, if you ask me, because that ain't the only connection. Because when they start redoing Pike's Place in the 1980s, they renovate Pike's Place Market in Seattle. They do a fundraising effort, put your name on a brick on the new bricks that are going down in Pike's Place, the ones that are still there today. I've seen this brick. The Heaven's Gate cult purchased the brick on the site where Edmund Creffield, that Holy Rollers cult leader, was murdered by one of his cult members who had chased him, the father of the young woman or the husband of the woman that he had run off with. So there's a connectivity there that they're venerating that man in that site in the 1980s, I think almost 60 years after his murder, and they've already recruited all those people. So what I'm saying is, even though these things are described in our history as maybe a Christian fundamentalist sex cult out of Oregon, I think there's a lot more alien stuff involved. So when I see Scientologists, very wealthy Scientologists, much like Ghislaine Maxwell's sister and brother-in-law, were folks at the early onset of developing the interwebs, and that is Reed Slatkin and his associates there. They were early entrepreneurs and developers in interweb activities in the 90s. And they moved up to Southern Oregon in the late 90s, I believe it was, and bought a huge ranch and have bought a lot of the things in the town, the stores. They operate basically a couple of the local economy, if you will. But in more recent years, those folks, and they've had some, a lot of controversy around those aspects, proceeding in more recent years. But more recent years, they have allowed because the property was transferred, but now it's back in the ownership of these Scientologists, right? This couple. And but in the recent years in between, they had transferred it to this cult, these two cult leaders. This woman and this man. The man professes to be from some Australian cult. He's got a very murky background. I can't find a lot of history. I have some ideas of who he actually may be. And the woman seems to have come from the porn industry in the valley of San Fernando Valley there, just north of Los Angeles. And then there are these cult leaders who are charging these tens of thousands of dollars for activities and events and seminars. If you even watch their sales pitch, it doesn't even make any sense. The whole thing looks a lot like money laundering to me, but it is all connected to the same people in Scientology. And, is this an independent kind of Scientology offshoot? I have no idea, but the folks that own the property, they let all this stuff go down. All of the hotels, the seminars they would host in town were owned by the same people that own the property, the Scientologists, right? So the same people that now back own that property again after this cult was run out of town. The Twin Rays cult, that is, right? So very interesting stuff. It was recently brought to my attention, all these matters, via the folks over at Cosmic Peach and Conspiracy Playtime, Julia and Colby and their friend Lola, because I never heard of this stuff, and it's been popping off in recent years. It's recently kind of just ended. But people are still trying to, once the dust is settled, and folks are still trying to figure out what happened. These Scientologists still own all that stuff down there. The real estate, the place where this cult was operating. They are now the owners again, on paper, right? So they were probably the owners the entire time because again, this cult was all doing all their seminars and activities at businesses and hotels owned by those same Scientologists, that same couple that owns the estate. So folks in that area seem to be my assessment based upon my conversation with the locals there, including the one that brought to my attention there, Lola and Cosmic Peach and Colby there at Conspiracy Playtime, that these folks are in the local area are just, as the dust is settling from these more recent events with this Twin Rays cult, they're just trying to figure out what the hell happened. But while they're doing that, I think they realize that the Scientologists still own this area though around there, right? A lot of weird environment, man. A lot of weird environment.
Yeah. We mentioned a little bit of Heaven's Gate. That was Applewhite. So was he part of that, the Holy Rollers that were here in the Oregon, or?
Well, so I can't figure out, man. I've done a good effort on trying to figure out how the hell Marshall Applewhite knew to go to Waldport, Oregon, host a seminar to recruit for his ancient alien cargo cult, and would, recruiting from this other cult. And then why they're venerating it by putting that brick there later. I don't have an idea, but here's what I can tell you. The Mormons seem to be an offshoot of the secret society that started America, the Society of the Cincinnati. I would argue they have some ancient alien cargo cult belief systems. And so as we see exhibited by their offshoot, the Mormons, including which Joseph Smith, his grandfather was an original member of this society. And the membership's passed down like a knighthood through the paternal bloodlines. So Joseph would have likely gotten that membership, it seems, through his father. Marshall Applewhite has the same lineage to that same society through his paternal lineage. Jack Parsons has that same lineage to his paternal lineage. So when I've been unpacking a lot of these ideas around these matters in the new series I'm doing on Operation GCD. In fact, the first one's going to be tomorrow on Operation GCD Sundays, Occult Genealogy of America, where I'm looking at not only just the events, these high profile kind of events in our, American society and, folklore and parapolitics, if you will, but also, the victims, understand the victimology and understand the people who are perpetrating these things. Because why does it always keep coming back? I have an theory that everything in all conspiracies in America come back to the Society of Cincinnati. And more and more I look at it, that's the case, because nonetheless, like I said, Parsons, his third great grandfather, Jack Parsons, right? The guy, the Agape Lodge, OTO, right? Captain in the Massachusetts chapter, just the same as Joseph Smith's. Joseph Smith's great grandfather was one of the accusers in the Salem witch trial. Jack Parsons' fourth great grandmother Parsons was an accused witch. So you see the same men of the society, Parsons and Smith, and their forefathers, right? Smith, that is an accuser, and then you see the same thing on the Parsons side with the witch. So you have to ask, why are these people, or these are the most important folks in occult American history? Joseph Smith, Jack Parsons, right? And then why do we see other folks like Applewhite with the same kind of pattern of ancestry, right?
Yeah, that does actually sound interesting. I don't think I've heard of the Society of Cincinnati. This was post-Revolutionary War. Is that when that society starts?
If you take a tour of their headquarters in Washington, D.C. today, that is the narrative they will sell you. That is not accurate. They formed on May 13th, Friday the 13th, 1783. America formed in September of 1783. Was it September 4th, 1783 in the Treaty of Paris, maybe? Could be wrong. We'll call it circa September 4th. But nonetheless, there's a 3-month difference there, right? So they formed before America, and these are the men that formed America.
Yeah, I see some of these names, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton.
Well, again, would you believe once you start looking at all these cases of all these occult business in America, everything kind of goes back to the society, not just that, again, the parapolitics. So we see an incident like JFK, right? JFK is connected to aliens as documented by Peter Levenda and his sinister forces, back to that alien seance with the Army PSYOPs intel officer Andrew P. Hartz, and then Blue Bloods in New Year's Eve in Maine back in 51, right? So we see that there. We see JFK is a member of the society by virtue of being the U.S. president. We see his father-in-law, Jack Bouvier, Jacqueline's father, is a hereditary member of the Maryland chapter of the society, confirmed, and I suspect also a member of the French chapter. There's 13 original chapters from the colonies, and there's a French chapter because the French and American revolutions were the same. And the French chapter, there was an Admiral Bouvier. Admiral Bouvier, I do strongly suspect, is the ancestor in that Bouvier line of Jack Bouvier, but nonetheless, he was a member of the Maryland chapter for sure, right? For sure. So we see an incident like the JFK assassination, and we see the JFK's a member. We see his father-in-law's a member. We see Lee Harvey Oswald, his third great-grandfather, disregard second great-grandfather, was a major in the Georgia chapter of the Society of the Cincinnati. So we see he's a member, very likely through his hereditary membership. Tracking his paternal line, it seems Lee Harvey's grandfather, a colonel in the Confederate Army. Most of the officers from the Revolutionary Army, their descendants and thereby hereditary members of the society, were also officers in the Civil War. For example, Clan Vance, you'll see the guy who started the state of North Carolina, the delegate in 1789, Captain David Vance from the Society of the Cincinnati chapter of North Carolina. His grandson was General Zebulon Vance of the Confederate Army, and he was a 2-time governor of North Carolina. So in the same capacity, Lee Harvey Oswald's grandfather was a colonel, so his father was probably a member, right? His father was probably a member, and Lee Harvey got that membership, it seems. So we see a situation like that, and that makes it changes the narrative there. We have all this society business circling all around that. J. Edgar Hoover, a member of the New York chapter, confirmed. So these are the elements that I'm saying in regards to the occult genealogy of America. As we see it in the occult side, we see it in the parapolitics side, and it all goes back to the society.
That does sound interesting. Hey, while we were chatting earlier, you were talking about this guy. His name is J.J. Bryan, and not the president, not the vice president.
Not to be confused with J.J. Vance. It's the wrong J.J. But J.J. Bryan worked for Henry Kissinger's right-hand man, Major Brent Scowcroft, Air Force General and National Security Advisor to two presidents. He's also the vice president of the Corporation of Kissinger and Associates. Like I said, Kissinger's right-hand man. Now, Kissinger is connected, and no one could ever explain it. The tabloids and everything else were always like, why is Henry Kissinger always running around with that Hollywood movie producer, Bob Cocaine Evans? Well, this is before he was known as Bob Cocaine, but it's nonetheless Bob Cocaine Evans. He gave himself the nickname, and no one could explain it. Well, Bob Cocaine Evans was a leader in the process in Los Angeles, ordering the hit on process New York leader Roy Radin as depicted in The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. So you see the connectivity to the process going back to the late 60s and early 70s, and then you see Kissinger's right-hand man, Brent Scowcroft, and his assistant, J.J. Bryan, not his birth name. He was born in Portland, Oregon, by the name of Jonathan Friel. And his Scowcroft connection ain't his only Mormon connections either. So he changes his name to J.J. Bryan. I think he's trying to out J.J. me, but, that's never going to happen. So he leaves employ from Brent Scowcroft and starts his own process church cult. And then he does that, well-financed through art galleries, the Victorian art galleries in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. And it's all, they got the swastika out front, the process logo. He had a band. He had a studio in his New York art gallery. His band was the La Biancas, named after the Process Church Manson murders there in '69. And his band was, their name was the La Biancas. Their hit single, when I say that in being sarcastic, obviously, was Charles Manson is Jesus Christ. So these folks were outwardly processing in every regard. J.J. Bryan integrated himself into the Nickelodeon crowd. In fact, one of his closest friends, and I presume was a member of his Process Church Victorian cult, was Amanda Bynes, the actress Amanda Bynes. So in regards to their ancient alien cargo cult philosophies, they had a god named Alan. Alan lived in a different space-time as a disembodied spirit in an ancient past. And they communicated with him. This is all on their website. And they communicated with him, through varying capacities, would sound like rituals. So we're talking the same things. Essentially, this art gallery in the East Village of Manhattan, one I had walked by numerous times and paid no attention to, mind you. So, because I used to drink at McSorley's Old Ale House. That was my usual haunt in Manhattan for many years. Never lived there, but I was a regular at that bar. And I walked past this process spot and I never really paid attention to it because I didn't really know much about the process then. But nonetheless, it seems like that art gallery in Manhattan or Miami, Washington, D.C., or Los Angeles, for that matter, which one of their locations, they're essentially doing the same things those folks on that South Pacific Island are doing, some sort of weird ritual trying to call their ancient alien god, you know what I mean? But we'll never achieve those ends because it's much like those South Pacific folks, they can dance all day, man. That G.I. Joe ain't dropping any more cargo. Isn't it strange, though? So we're seeing the PSYOP, the alien stuff with the Mormon stuff before with the skinwalkers and the Pentagon. We see the same national security elements, right, quote unquote, Nazi national security. So if BT, sir, if you're not familiar, if your audience is not familiar, we don't have free speech in America. Free speech was eradicated via the National Security Act of 1947. And when it instituted the elements of quote unquote matters of national security, where three folks can stamp things, national security, and no one will ever know about it. Some of those three folks in many over decades of American history in the last 60 years have been Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft. So we see the PSYOP Mormon alien stuff. We see the national security alien stuff. We see a great example with J.J. Bryan. So if minority theory is this weird cultist that claims to be from Australia that popped up there in Southern Oregon, financed by these Scientologists, again, the process is the dark wing of Scientology. So, on paper, they claim to be an offshoot, but it's nonsense. Either way, there's a connection, right? So there's the Twin Rays cult leader, dude. He looks so much like J.J. Bryan. J.J. Bryan allegedly dies in 2021 at the age of 38 for no good reason. He just died. He's got no death records that I've sought those death records out of Florida, a state with very liberal, some of the best laws as far as public access to things, government documents and their sunshine laws. I got nothing. And his gravesite is merely a temporary placard in a memorial garden. So when I see a guy look strikingly similar to him doing a lot of the same, you know what I mean? I'm like, wait a second here. As I already thought he didn't die. I'm like, is that J.J. Bryan? This character, he's got some weird cult name he goes by, and he claims to come from Australia. Again, his background's dubious, and his cult partner leader there in Southern Oregon seems to have come from the porn industry. So you just take a look at her. You can just be like, she does porn. And then I looked to see where she came from, and she lived in the Valley. I'm like, well, of course she does porn. She came from the Valley.
Right.
So I think these things are ongoing, man. They'll wrap up an op and maybe pop up a new op or something, right? That's kind of, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's kind of what I was getting at with that. And appreciate you taking the ride and my verbose explanation of J.J. Bryan. But he's an interesting character with roots to Portland. He's born in Portland.
Right. And what connection does this have with this Twin Ray situation you'd sent me?
So he's the Twin Rays is I forget the name of the exact town. I'll tell you. It's just on Southern Oregon, just across the border. So they were financed by this wealthy Scientology couple down there, and again, all their seminars that they would host. These again, dude, they're charging like tens of thousands of dollars. Dude, people were attending these things. There's so much criminality that was involved. They got run out of town after like 3 years. But the seminars they were all hosting were the Scientologists' businesses and hotels that own the estate which the cult was operating on, right? And they just pop in there out of nowhere, right? And all the townspeople were really creeped out. Again, I don't think the show's been published yet. I'm going to be publishing, I think, on my RSS feed this week to hear from firsthand from some of those locals there. Again, the woman that brought the whole story to my attention, Lola, she's a local there and has experienced and witnessed these activities of this cult and has been creeped out by it. So, and a lot of that is still persisting down there, but because the Scientologists still own those businesses in that estate. But it seems that someone shipped in this weird cult leader who looks a lot like J.J. Bryan for this 3-year stint or so down there to operate this thing called the Twin Rays cult. And they hosted these, the seminars reek of Scientology, talking about golden age. It's a very Scientology term under Miscavige. And then they're doing these, it's all you ever seen a Scientology performance? So they do those very Nazi-like, ceremonies, right? Very glamorous, lots of lights and gold and shit and huge stage. Same thing going on here, but doing it in the small town in Oregon. And again, financed by Scientologists. And again, the guy that pops in there, who claims to be this dude from Australia running this Twin Rays cult along with his porno actress associate, lady, the other co-cult leader there. She's the other Twin Ray, if you will, one half of the Twin Rays. He has no background. And again, he looks a lot like J.J. Bryan. And again, J.J. Bryan would be doing spooky Scientology stuff, no doubt. Again, I think a lot of this stuff is money laundering to a certain degree. I mean, let me just bring up some of these rates they were charging folks, dude. It's astronomical, dude. It's ridiculous. It's, but like I said, so they wrap up this one. They've left, right? The cult leaders, right? The J.J. Bryan lookalike and his porno actress cult leader lady. They've been running out of town, but the Scientologists still own all the businesses in those states. So are they just going to bring in a new operation in a couple of years and run a new cult there? Because that is a Scientology thing to do, right there.
Yeah, that was in Ashland, Oregon.
Yep, that's it, Ashland, Oregon. Yep.
That's right on the border between Oregon and California, I believe.
Yeah, dude. And this guy claims to be named Jeff. He doesn't look like a Jeff. And again, J.J. Bryan's already a man with numerous faces, dude. He's already a spook. So I did forget that part. So briefly, between his time as the assistant to Brent Scowcroft for, I believe, 6 years in the early aughts, from 2000 to 2001 to 2007, I believe it was. He spent a year and a half as an quote-unquote art student and gets arrested doing spook activities in Libya. if you think about the time frame in Libya, this is in the preceding years of Merck and Gaddafi. So he's over there he gets busted portraying himself as a spook. Somehow gets out of that, comes back to America and starts that process church cult out of that art gallery. So, again, a very well-financed one as well, right? So where are they getting the money from? Why is it always spook stuff? I don't know, but I think that's one thing to consider when you see these two cult leaders pop up in Southern Oregon out financed by Scientology doing Scientology stuff. Their whole business model is based around attending these Scientology businesses and hotels and being their patrons. You have to ask yourself, like, again, what is really going on here? They moved in 2020. They just got ran out here, and they were charging $111 for like gold fleckled water. And this is in their retreats. They opened a store, then they got this 11,000 square foot home on a 96 acres owned by them Scientologists, and again, all of their retreats would only frequent the owners of that estate who now own that estate again. It was only temporarily over to these Twin Rays folks, right? And his name's not Jeff. I forget what his name. The name this guy claims even have is stupid. Oh, they talk about the Waldport folks in this article. That's interesting. I'm looking at an article right now that it's describing these matters. I'm trying to find this dude's name. Yeah, they say they started a 501c3 again, dude. They said on paper it was no longer the Scientologists, and then it was Scientologists again now once they ran out of town. So a lot of questions there, but they were doing a lot of New Age stuff, which isn't just not that different from that area. But that's what I'm saying. Like, when they repackage things, they're going to repackage things that are acceptable to a region, which they can then stimulate, economic growth from these matters. And that's all they've done here. And then they get run out of town and they go do their ancient alien cargo stuff elsewhere. So it's the Newman family. And they were involved. They're OG, high-ranking Scientologists involved with folks like business matters with another Scientologist, Reed Slack, and he went to prison for fraud over those matters. And I think they were the father or godparents of maybe or guardians of Slacken's kids or something like that. There's a lot of criminality associated with these folks in the past as well before this, but he goes by Akasha Sananda.
Okay. Yeah.
And he's not an
Rajneesh.
Akasha, if you ask me. Yeah, dude, exactly, right? So, and the Rajneesh people, dude, I mean, they have so many tentacles to so much stuff, not the least of which Mormons. So when they built that big airstrip up there and then they bought that big airplane, they bought that from Hughes Aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Not only was Howard Hughes surrounded by Mormons, he himself was very likely a member of the Society of Cincinnati from a fellow by the name of Colonel Gano. He was a chaplain for the Maryland chapter of the Society of Cincinnati, a very prominent man in American history. And that was Howard Hughes' mother. Now, you may be thinking, I said paternal lines. Well, yeah, sometimes when there's not a paternal to go to, it goes through the daughters to the next available male. That's what happened with Jack Bouvier. So Jack Bouvier, Jacqueline Kennedy's father, right? Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, her father, he received membership not just from his mother, but from not just her mother, her mother's father. So two generations up, no sons, went down to Jack. And then John F. He dies in 1957, so JFK Jr. was born into the Society of the Cincinnati, it seems, because he was the only paternal descendant available for John Bouvier. So when that puts JFK Jr.'s life in a different light, when you see that he's a member of a Society of the Cincinnati, born into it, because his grandfather died in 1957, he's born, I think, in 1961 or 60, and he starts a magazine named George in 1990, I think, when he enters politics. The first president, general, and founder of the society being George Washington, obviously, so that's interesting. And then when his death comes into a new light as well, if he's getting murked as a Society of Cincinnati member, because I think that's a going trend I've noticed. For one quick note on that, if I may, relative to these kind of occult matters and seemingly also parapolitical stuff, and homicidal psychopathic serial killers that I've been studying that have done a lot of murder in Oregon, specifically a Lover's Lane murder on November 26, 1960 in Portland. Ed Edwards, he was arrested under the name Dr. James Garfield Langley, which I would argue is his CIA cover name he was issued under an Operation Chaos style program, like his friend Charles Manson. Charles Manson and Ed knew each other since 52, and this is now 69 that I'm describing, or 60 were in Portland. But in 69, a man in a hood in Lake Berryessa, known as the Zodiac Killer, or at least a Zodiac Killer and possibly a team of Zodiac Killers, but that man in the hood murders a woman named Cecilia Shepard on September 27th, 1969 in Lake Berryessa, Northern California. Not that far south from places like Ashland, Oregon and whatnot, but the Cecilia Shepard dies. Brian Hartnell, her boyfriend there in the Lover's Lane style attack, was just like Ed's known for. He was stabbed a bunch of times, but he survived. I would argue that was not the intent. I would argue he was intended to die. There's arguments I've come across where, along these same lines of arguing around Ed's presence there and him being the Zodiac, they would argue otherwise. But nonetheless, Brian Hartnell just happened to be the grandson of a hereditary member of the Society of Cincinnati. His mother's father, who was the second great grandson of a Colonel Walker. His mother's a Walker. His maternal grandfather had no sons. His mother had one son, eldest son there, Brian, and his grandfather passed in 67. So did 17 or 18-year-old Brian Hartnell become a member of the Society of Cincinnati? I think so, and from a prominent member. Colonel Walker was the aide-de-camp to General von Steuben. General von Steuben was the aide-de-camp to George Washington. Colonel Walker was personal friends with George Washington. So you see a hereditary member possibly getting murked in an occult-style ritual sacrifice that also they use. What I argue is all these matters, they go around the whole hog effect. They're going to use it to profit in every capacity possible, right? And in this capacity, so you have a Society of Cincinnati hit, an occult ritual sacrifice, psychological operations to terrorize the San Francisco Bay Area, Operation Gladio style, and they filmed a snuff film. Because two men on a boat sat there on the boat for 30 minutes by reports from Hartnell, who survived, while they're screaming and dying out there, and they did not help. They did not get aid. He didn't say they had a camera, but I mean, they're just offshore there at the lake and they're filming. I mean, that'd be a great place to film it if they were going to film it. That's what I argue those two men were doing. So it's the whole hog effect, but we see these same kind of things going on around a lot of these matters. And so, I think a lot of times I think within conspiracy culture, we get hyper focused on it can only be a ritual sacrifice. It can only be this. And I don't think that's the application of what's going on here at all. And I think it's rooted in a lot of older feuding secret societies within the Society of Cincinnati framework.
Yeah, man, that would make sense. There's a lot going on, definitely. Cool. Go ahead and let the audience know what you're working on, because you're working on some new stuff you're doing on Sundays now. And wrap up. Give the deets, man.
I appreciate your time. I always enjoy, in the invite, sir, I always enjoy talking ancient alien cargo cults. Operation GCD Sundays, I talk ancient alien cargo cults just about any day of the week. But Operation GCD Sundays, I've been doing a series on kind of my GCD adventures in life, things I've encountered, high weirdness and true crime type events, those kind of things that have interested me over the years. Ed Edwards, for example, the most diabolical serial killer that you probably never heard of. Friends with Charles Manson, probably a CIA operative in some regard. He even said so himself, and the evidence seems to indicate. That's Sundays. I do a free Patreon preview on all my platforms, and then I do the remainder of the show over on Patreon. Folks, come check that out. And then I do Operation GCD Thursdays, the anatomy of a satanic panic, and a lot of these things we're talking about tonight go back. Kind of I cover on both of those things, because a lot of these things are interchangeable in these topics. It's not, these satanic murders like the Zodiac or the Manson stuff, Ed's friend, aren't that far away from matters such as the occult genealogy of America when we're looking at that Hartnell situation in the Zodiac. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate, U.S. Army Intelligence, the father of Sharon Tate, the actress who was murdered on August 8th, 1969 by the Manson family. He was very likely a member of the Society of Cincinnati out of the Virginia chapter. Lieutenant Jesse Tate was the original member, his second great-grandfather. He didn't have any sons. He didn't have any other since forth has no more grandsons. The hereditary member of Paul Tate died in Sharon Tate's belly, 8.5 months pregnant. That son. So these are the things that I'm saying are going across kind of both spectrums. And then that I'm doing over there, so folks can check that out. And then and also largely my Thursday series is the pretense of it, at least, is there was a satanic panic, a well-organized, well-crafted psychological operation centered around folks like Michael Aquino, the U.S. Army Special Forces Psychological Operations Officer, to convince folks not to trust their own senses. Pay no attention to the Satanists. Pay no attention to the satanic murders. These are not the satanic ritual abuses you're looking for. So I'm kind of unpacking the psychological operation, and then also doing some case studies into the events and crimes that we were told not to pay attention to. And like you were saying before, I was kind of trying to allude to there about getting hyper-focused on things. We're given these things a hyper-focus on, the Presidio, the McMartin, and then we're given a false narrative that's twisted around in this campaign of a psychological operation. But there are so many other examples that fit those exact same circumstances. McMartin, it's a widespread spectrum of victims and locations. So it's not just those one places at that one time. And I think that's part of the psychological operation and the hyper focus on these events that is part of the magic show that causes folks to not understand this problem has been plaguing America a long time. And would you believe it's all wrapped up in matters of national security? So that's always what it is, right? Especially with Aquino. And then Operation GCD Wednesdays, I do film reviews, and Fridays, I hope you'll join me again soon for Operation GCD's Fridays roundtable discussion on. We can get real weird on some Oregon stuff, man. I've been doing so much Oregon stuff, dude.
Whatever goes on. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Crazy.
No, it's good. I appreciate you coming on. Let me dip my toes into some conspiracy things going on. Appreciate you, JJ. You have a great evening.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.